Welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. I am Andrew Petiprin, your host, joined today by Jennifer Bryson, who is the translator of, I think, a very important new book. Well, it's an old book, but a new translation, a new edition from Ignatius Press called John Henry Newman, A Life Sacrificed. It has the wonderful portrait of Newman that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London on the cover. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm delighted to be here and to talk with you today.
I'm really delighted to talk to you, too, for a number of reasons. One is I'm an enormous Newman devotee, and so I know that a lot of our listeners will be as well. Maybe we'll get into some of the reasons why I'm a particular Newman devotee in a little bit. But I have to admit, I was very interested to learn about you and doing a little research about you. You have all kinds of accolades, of course, all kinds of things to your credit. You are a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. You've translated other works by this same author we're going to talk about today. You've written all kinds of things for different publications. You have a PhD from Yale. But two things really jumped off the page when I was looking at your biography. The first is that you studied Marxism in East Germany. Will you tell us something about that to get us started?
Yes. So I was a very naive 19-year-old teenager. This was my sophomore year of college. I was an undergraduate at Stanford. And I had done my junior year of high school at an Austrian high school, which is how I began to learn German. So I wanted to go overseas in college, and I wanted to go to a German-speaking or French-speaking university. And being adventurous as I was, I thought, and this was in the 1980s when there's still, the Iron Wall was still up, the Iron Curtain. I thought, East Germany, that would be interesting. Well, I got a little more interesting than I bargained for, but it was a life-changing experience. I spent 2 semesters at the Karl Marx University. And while I was there, I chose to focus on the study of Marxism-Leninism. And that is what led me to an experience of God. And my best friends that year in Leipzig were the Polish students who were courageous and full of faith and joyful. And although I was very anti-Catholic, I knew that my experience of God and what was going on in their lives were connected. And eventually through them came into the Catholic Church a few years later.
Wow, that's amazing. So you went to a kind of anti-God place, and you found God, or at least you sort of got onto the path there.
I think God broke into my life there, and yeah,
fascinating. And it was the Polish students in particular that kind of ministered to you in some way.
Yes, in addition to this experience I had while I was studying atheism, where I had an experience of God one day, that was combined with these beautiful friendships of the Polish students, who were some of the few who were courageous and crazy enough to befriend an American in East Germany. And in a very difficult situation. I mean, this really was a dictatorship. We were learning how to obliterate religion in society in our classes. I mean, systematically, philosophically, politically. Here were these students who were joyful and peaceful because of their faith.
Wow, that's amazing. A second detail that I'd love to hear about is you are passionate about getting politics out of sports, which is I wasn't expecting to see that on your kind of biographical information. Tell us about that before we move into the book we're going to discuss today.
Sure. Now, do you know that is what led me to Ida Görres?
No, please tell us that story.
Oh, so I like soccer and I like other sports. And I was very concerned when teams began coercing players to, or pressuring at least, to wear political symbols such as the LGBT rainbow on uniforms, and also the use of these political symbols on the field. And I thought, this is unfair to the players. And this is really harmful to society, because the sports field is one of the few places, and the stadium, this is one of the few places we have where everybody can come together and enjoy the game and see what's going to happen. Because that's an exciting thing about sports is you never know the outcome because it's live. And so I was working in Washington, D.C. at the time, have some familiarity with domestic politics, international politics, how religious freedom law works. And so I began an international campaign, a petition to FIFA, the international governing body for soccer, to require FIFA to implement its own rules. FIFA actually has international rules banning teams from placing political, personal, and religious images on uniforms and messages. And through that, I wanted to find allies in Europe, and a friend put me in touch with a woman in Europe. So while I'm working on this soccer petition, to prepare for a meeting with this woman, I looked up her background. I found out she had founded a German language Catholic online matchmaking site, sort of a German language counterpart to Catholic Match. The German one is called Kathtreff. And they recommended one book on marriage, just one. And it was this book from 1949. And so I immediately thought, oh, maybe it's good because it was written before things got completely crazy. But it was from an author I had never heard of, Ida Friederike Görres. And so that was what led me to want to find out who she was. I watched a lecture about Görres by Hanna-Barbara Gale-Falkowitz, a long name that's difficult for Americans, but is important to the book we're going to discuss today. And then I ordered the book from Austria. And when I read it, I was captivated, not within pages, within paragraphs. And when I discovered that it had not been translated, I just thought this has to be translated. And that was like the first few snowflakes that have led to a snowball rolling down the hill and have led to years of work now for me with Ida Görres.
Wow, that is a fantastic story, and I commend you certainly for your work on kind of trying to depoliticize sports. It really is annoying, and but how providential again, I guess, like your study in East Germany, and then like your sort of project for the sports thing that you're led to the work that you're doing now.
I have to attribute that to God, knowing that maybe I'm not going to go in the directions I need to go, and when I go down these other paths, He puts a fork in the road the other way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, let's talk about Ida Friederike Görres then. I was struck by what you're just saying about how you encountered this author you'd never heard of before, a work that had never been translated before, and it hit you within seconds as being just such an important work. I have friends who are sort of working in similar fields where there's just still you think everything's out there now, but it's not. It's not at all, not even close. And so I just think this is going to be a wonderful period that we're coming into now where we're just, major figures are going to sort of start coming into our lives. And it seems like Ida Görres is one of those figures.
Well, I'm excited for English-speaking readers to now have a second opportunity to discover her because, as we may discuss, she used to be well known. And some of her works were translated 50, 70 years ago. But there was a period of a Catholic renewal in Europe, and I'm familiar with the renewal in German-speaking Europe in the 1920s that Ida Görres was involved in. And from the 20s, 30s, and the next decades, there is just a treasure trove of Catholic authors. And because I was not Catholic when I learned German, I was unaware that there was this whole Catholic treasure trove in the German language. So it's also opened up for me an entire new sort of sub-universe in German. And not only is there a lot that hasn't been translated, there are many of these authors who are just barely known. And given the situation of the church in Germany, there's not interest in them in German-speaking Europe. So interestingly enough, they're becoming known once again through the English-speaking Catholic world. And we're in English blessed to have so many great Catholic publishers.
Yeah, like Ignatius, for example, and we're grateful that they've put this book out. So Ida Görres wrote, we're going to get into this book that she wrote about Newman. She wrote this book about marriage that you've just told us about. What are some of the other things that we can expect to see, like either that you're going to translate or that, that really need to come onto our radar in the coming years from her?
So the first book I translated by her came out in 2023 from Clooney Media, and that one is called The Church in the Flesh. She wrote it in 1950, and it's 6 letters to doubting, confused, increasingly secularized individuals about what the Catholic faith and what the Catholic Church really are. Beautiful, wonderful, powerful book. I was excited to get to translate it. I've got this book on Newman, and that's important because hagiography was really the great strength of Ida Görres. Already in the 1930s, she was writing very important books about what sanctity is and also about the lives of saints, both in long essays and in some books.
Yeah. This particular book is interesting. This book about Newman coming from a German, because Newman is well known in the English speaking world. Obviously, I still think his influence is sort of underappreciated, and that I hope will grow. But I mean, I've studied a lot of Newman and didn't really realize he had great defenders, maybe aside from Joseph Ratzinger, sort of in the German speaking world. Now, Ratzinger knew Görres, is that correct? And he knew of her work.
They began corresponding in the 1960s. In the 1960s is when she discovered his work, and it was at a time when she was increasingly alarmed by developments she was witnessing. And when she discovered Joseph Ratzinger, then the young Father Joseph Ratzinger, she was tremendously excited. In a letter she wrote that we now have published in German, she even said, I've found my prophet in Israel. She was looking for a voice that was rooted in faith, but able to engage the modern world. And so after some years of correspondence, and they had met, then when she died in 1971, he gave the eulogy at her funeral. And he has mentioned her several times in his works, and I have found several of those references.
Wow, I think that's a really important connection that I hope people will appreciate. I mean, at least for my part, if she's good enough for Ratzinger, she's more than good enough for me. So I think that's a really important detail about her biography, that she was connected to Ratzinger in that way. Let's talk about what Newman meant to her then. You mentioned the woman who wrote the introduction, who has a long name, Hanna Barbara Gerl-Falkowitz. She said in her introduction that this book, John Henry Newman, A Life Sacrificed, is about Görres in as much as it's about Newman. I mean, in other words, she's trying to say this is really a book about the person who wrote it, every bit as much as it is about the person she wants us to get to know. So tell us something about that.
Sure. Now, a reader could read the book and I think just read, chapters 1 through 9, and then chapters 10 and 11, these separate sections of the book, and get deep into Newman. But through the introduction by Dr. Gerl-Falkowitz and also the translator's note, it sheds this second layer of light on the book, in that here you have somebody who's been through the Catholic renewal in Germany in the 1920s and into the early 30s that gets crushed by the Nazi regime. Some of the famous Catholic resistance figures to the Nazis came out of that movement. Also, their journals were those who were targeted and crushed by the Nazis. The horror of World War II in Nazi Germany. And then you come out of that to this opportunity to reshape their culture. And Newman at that point becomes a pivotal figure. And I hadn't realized how important Newman was to German-speaking Catholics, because Görres helps us understand that for German-speaking Catholics and her, this is where we start to understand her trajectory. Newman was really, by the mid-1940s, considered a primary guiding light for what they were going to do going forward. So we experience where Görres is looking for hope at this point, what has been shaping her own life. So the book has layers.
It is what you said before. You said, Newman is this important figure among Catholics in Germany who are sort of trying to rebuild after the kind of almost annihilation of the movement at the hands of the Nazis. Is it because Newman had this sort of, is it because of kind of Newman's position towards modernity, or like what is it exactly about Newman that sort of that they look to him as like this key figure in looking forward to the renewal of the church?
It's this balance that he has, and Görres really hones in on this, and she helped me to understand it better. A balance of having a deep intellectual understanding and a deep theological understanding of what is starting to really go wrong in the West.
Yeah.
And so he understands the problem, and he chooses to pursue truth and faith. And so he's a figure who's staked his flag and is going to oppose these dangerous currents. So she trusts him. But he doesn't just run to the past and say, oh my gosh, we've got to go back to like it was 200 years ago. He lives in the world he's in. And she, at the very last sentence of the book, if she identifies him not as the evening star of a culture and civilization that are fading, but interestingly, she identifies John Henry Newman as the morning star for the 20th century, and I would say into the 21st century, that he was setting something in motion that would be fundamental for Catholics. And,
Go ahead.
Well, also, the Catholic renewal movement in Germany in the 20s and 30s also recognized some of this, because that's when the most important translations of Newman from English into German began. But then after World War II is when they focused, an entire monastery took on translating volumes of Newman's work from English to German after World War II.
Wow, I didn't know that. And well, let me pause there then and ask you kind of about the translation issue. I've got a lot of thoughts, but you talk about in your preface that you had to do a kind of a lot of forensic work to because what you're dealing with is a writer who wrote in English who then is translated into German, and now you're translating a book about this English writer back into English. So what was that like?
So I had to tease out the different parts of the text. There's the voice of Ida Görres, and that I've got to translate from German into English. But she was very widely read, and when she would write about a saint, and we saw this in her most famous book on Saint Therese of Lisieux, that's still available today from Ignatius Press. It's called The Hidden Face. She does deep primary source research. And so in this book on Newman, she quotes many primary source works, sermons, letters, and secondary works too, from contemporaries and close contemporaries about Newman. So it was absolutely imperative for me as the translator to provide those texts to the English language reader in the original English. In translation, there's something called a back translation. That's a big no-no. And a back translation would be, for example, if Ida Görres translated something by Newman from English to German, and then I, as another translator, come along. If I were to translate those quotations of Newman from her German into my English, that's not what Newman said.
Yeah.
However, this book was not published during her lifetime. It was found as an unpublished manuscript in the 1990s. And because it wasn't quite finished, and also the sections of it she had put together for oral presentations she had given, and we have some records of where and when she gave those presentations. At least 50% of the quotes did not have citations. And then for some of the quotations that had citations, the German editor had put footnotes for the German edition that helps sometimes. But I had to create this huge spreadsheet of quotes from unidentified sources. And now here's the challenge. I've got it in German and am familiar with translating German from German to English, but I have to figure out not how it would sound in modern day English. I have to guess what it might have been in Newman's English, not only 19th century English, but that beautiful, rich English of Newman. Mm-hmm. It took months, but I just didn't let up, and I had a wonderful undergraduate intern assisting me.
I just love this image.
St. Thomas in Minnesota.
Oh, right on. I just love this image. Yeah, what a fascinating thing to be doing. To sort of try to reconstruct a Newman sentence, for example, out of 20th century German, so that then you can try and match it to like a Newman original. that it actually comes from. I love that.
Like there was one sentence in a different book by Görres that was one of my first Newman challenges. And it's a book on marriage that's coming out next year from CUA Press, a different one from the 1949 one I told you about. And there's something about a ship being tied to port. So in Newman's collected works, thanks to the National Institute of Newman Studies, I'm able to access electronic versions and do word searches. I'm searching for words like ship, port. But it turns out the sentence is that there's a vessel moored.
Right.
And those weren't the words I was searching for. And that one, I had just trial and error. And then sometimes I'd set it aside, try again. Maybe I'd stumble on it later. But it ultimately, I succeeded in finding the original sources. And so readers are getting my translation of Görres's book about Newman, as well as a great deal of Newman's sermons and letters in the book.
Yeah. And that's really a nice thing about the book. And thank you for doing that hard work. My goodness, to like reconstruct all of this, because I think that Görres's perspective on Newman is one. I mean, I've read a lot of Newman and read a lot about Newman, but I was really I don't know if I was surprised, but I was really impressed with her perspective on him. For all that I know about Newman, her kind of central point that, we appreciate Newman for his genius and this and this and this and this and this, right? But really the important thing about Newman is, in a sense, that his life was like that of an early Christian, in the sense that he had prestige, he had everything going for him in society, and he basically threw it all away for a life of obscurity because he was convicted of the truth of the gospel. Is that basically what Görres is kind of presenting to us?
Yeah, and I read through a pre-publication draft of the manuscript with a few friends, and two of them are very into Newman. And one of them said to me, I had not realized how much Newman suffered.
Yeah.
She helps us understand both things that happened to him, but also we see this in her other works on the saints. She has this astonishing ability to try gently to get into the interior without trying to read too much.
Yeah.
And so she not only helps us see how much Newman had to give up and that he suffered for that, but also this is where she finds the greatest meaning in his life, in his sanctity. And she felt during her lifetime that he would someday be raised to the altars of the saints.
Did she? She really expected that he would be canonized one day.
Yes, and she mentions this in the book. She said, I don't know, but she even calls him sometimes, I think he was a Satan.
Yeah, one of the things that is sometimes talked about with regard to Newman is sort of what he is as a 19th century figure. Is he a romantic? Is he what is he? Is sort of typical Victorian intellectual or whatever? And I think Görres does such an interesting job sort of situating him in that world as this very, very different kind of figure in many ways than kind of the famous intellectual heroes of the era. But ultimately, I think she makes a pretty good case that he's the one that is going to last. Like he's the one who is sort of a man kind of out of his own time in some respects, even though we think of him as being such a figure of the 19th century, right?
Because he's able to see what matters and what's deeper than his own time. But in one of the chapters of the book I really like, it's in chapter 2 called The Golden Apple. And I won't explain what that means. Readers will have to find out. Görres has this relatively short, but I find really rich setting of the scene of the mindset of 19th century Europe. And this is then what sets up her ability then to contrast Newman, to place him within that. And readers who aren't deeply read in 19th century European history, I think it's a tremendously helpful and, as I said, remarkably short setting of the scene.
I absolutely loved that chapter, and especially the very beginning, like the first page or two of that chapter is just terrific. And I think, Jennifer, to your point, like what a modern reader will get out of that, at least I did, is he or she will immediately see that, like, in some respects, our times are very much like Newman's, in the sense that, like, there's this like myth of progress that just is so in the water, right? Everything's always getting better and anything's possible. Just reach out and grab it, and Newman's kind of going, I don't know about that. Let's be careful about that. And I think that's a message we need to hear.
Yeah. And also in this 19th century picture that she helps us see, there is this move to place physical achievements in the material world and material life into the center of gravity. And she helps us see that Newman always is able to realize there's something much deeper.
Yeah, I mean, namely the truth, right? and my goodness, does that come through in Görres's book? Just how Newman is laudable for his interest in the truth, and another way to put it is his interest in reality. Like we're in some senses all moving around in this world content with something fake. And Newman, even though he was quite a different man than most of the people of his time, it's like when we look back on him, and probably Görres too in her time, we see people who really wanted to live in reality.
Well, and something that's going to be exciting, although I admit I have a little apprehension. I think any author or translator isn't sure what's going to come out in the reviews of the book. But because I'm not a Newman specialist per se, I'm a lover of Newman, of some familiarity with him, had to up my game to translate this book. I'm not a Newman specialist, and thus it's been so interesting for me as a few people have started to read the book who have much deeper and broader knowledge of Newman than I do, to start to hear their perspectives.
Yeah. Well, I think it will appeal to people who maybe have never read any Newman, or don't know much about him, or know that he's sort of one of these sort of important people that they should know about. I think this is a great book to turn to, really, or to put into somebody's hand to learn about him.
And something that Ignatius Press agreed to add to the English edition that is not in the German edition is a timeline of the life of Saint John Henry Newman. Because while Görres is providing us an arc of his life from start to finish, her heart is going for some of these deep issues about sacrifice and suffering, and some of the framework of all these different complicated things happening around just help to be aware of. So I was very pleased that when I suggested adding a timeline of his life, the editor at Ignatius Press readily agreed.
That's so useful with Newman. I mean, because with it, there's a great timeline in the Norton Critical Edition of the Apologia Pro Vita Sua too that I look back at it all the time as I'm trying to remember. Oh wait, was he in Sicily at this point? And oh yeah, this is after the whatever sermon. And oh yeah, and then 1845 is the kind of the watershed, right? So he's such an interesting figure in that way to kind of look at his life along this timeline. And maybe just to continue that point, when as Görres is sort of situating Newman, and very much emphasizing this idea of this sacrificial life and all of that. One of the things I loved was she does refer to the Apologia a lot, which is his great autobiography, but she also refers to his novel Loss and Gain a lot, which is so important. I'm such like a sort of such a fan and somebody who raves about that novel to people, because I think, how do you talk about your own sacrifice? It ends up coming across kind of maybe self-righteous or proud or something like that, but like write a novel about it. And that's what Newman did with Loss and Gain.
And I have found Loss and Gain is not as well known as one might expect.
Yeah.
I didn't know about Loss and Gain until after I'd already been reading Newman for several years. So Görres makes interesting, she understands it's a novel, but I think she makes really appropriate use of some passages of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly Newman telling the story of someone like him who, who became a Roman Catholic at a time when it was essentially unheard of in the society in which he lived. And, I mentioned before that, I have sort of personal reasons for loving Newman. One of them is I myself used to be an Anglican minister. I was an Episcopal priest. And so, my friends and I who have made that same journey, we joke that, it's actually, nowadays when you convert, people are like, oh, okay, good for you. Oh, that's nice. But we have to remember that that's the case because people like Newman did it first a long time ago, Yeah. And Görres too. Now she considered herself something of a convert, even though, she wasn't like a convert in that same sense that Newman was, but like she really considered herself to have experienced a big change that deepened her faith. Tell us about that.
So she was born in 1901, and I think to understand that change, a little about where she's coming from would help. Her father was a diplomat in the Habsburg Empire. When he was stationed in Tokyo, he met a Japanese woman and married her, and that was Görres' mother. Her father was a 19th century European classical liberal. Now he still identifies as Catholic, but what he likes the fact that the Catholic Church provides some order to society and lots of charity. His sort of philosophy, I just finished reading a book by him, is very much what's going to become the sources of the anti-Catholic movement and skepticism. So, that's her father's influence. And even though he dies when she's very young, she's born in 1901, he dies in 1906, he has a great deal of influence on forming and shaping her two older brothers, who have had more of their life with their father than she had, and they're going to be very influential. And also, she grew up in the Bohemian forest on the family estate. And this is important because she tells us that almost all she had at home was her father's library. And I visited the family estate last year, and it is in a little village. I mean, there is nothing around. So I had kept noticing while reading Görres that I kept learning about the 19th century and 19th century philosophy and 19th century literature and art. And I realize now it's because she grew up with a library that had been built before her father died in 1906. So she has these increasingly anti-Catholic influences. Her older brothers, especially one who became quite famous named Richard, was cynical about the Catholic Church. I mean, he would mock the Catholic Church and mocked the younger sisters for seeing anything in the Catholic Church. That's her childhood. Now, she's baptized 2 days after she's born. There's a little Catholic church in the village, and also there is a chapel inside the family estate. But on top of that, her father's died, and her mother, being Japanese, her mother never really learns German to a high level. Her mother had to convert for the marriage, but it's unclear to me how much of a role the faith plays in her mother's life. Anne Görres has an English nanny, by the way, which is how she learns English so well. She's not being raised in a faith focused Catholic household. But when she goes to boarding school as a young girl in Austria, she attends 2 different boarding schools. And in the second one, run by the Mary Ward sisters, she experiences being loved, which was not a central part of her childhood at home. And when she's a teenager at this boarding school, she has some type of reversion, faith awakening experience that changes the trajectory of her entire life.
Wow.
And she's always grateful for that moment, that change. She writes about it.
Just interesting. Just out of curiosity, which authors were on her father's shelves? I mean, was it philosophers like Nietzsche and stuff like that, or is it sort of more? What was it? What was she reading?
So I think Nietzsche was there because Görres quotes Nietzsche.
Right.
She definitely was reading him some, although of course with a critical eye. Also, the Romantics. She knew Goethe's work very, very well. And other German Romantic authors in literature, in poetry. Also, the way one looks at history through that sort of 19th century classical liberal lens. It keeps coming up here and there in her works. And as I said, it was that realization when she commented once about how growing up, what she had at home was her father's library. And she was clearly a very intelligent young woman who loved to read.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I'm fascinated by what people kind of, what books influence people to get where they are. I think it's entirely possible to read a library full of 19th century liberalism and end up becoming a committed Catholic, actually. So that's pretty cool.
I think it can help us understand how her most famous book is about Saint Therese of Lisieux. And in that, too, she tries to help readers understand the context, the 19th century context around Saint Therese. And I would think it contributed to her really valuing Newman, realizing what a contrast what he was to what she had been reading growing up. Yeah.
I mean, so Therese of Lisieux and Newman. I mean, it seems like she's picking these. I mean, she's picking saints. I mean, right. I mean, that sort of goes without saying, but I mean, these are people who have this sort of who answer a radical call. It seems to me.
Well, and Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was one of her favorites. And her first book that's translated into English, called The Nature of Sanctity, is a dialogue about the life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. And Saint Elizabeth of Hungary makes this incredibly radical choice.
Yeah.
So I think you're onto something, that there's something about radical choice that she is able to understand, perhaps because of her own radical turn in her life.
Is that something that also was heightened in her because of the Nazi time? I mean, she did not, die a martyr's death at the hands of the Nazis, like, say, Franz Jägerstätter did or something. But I mean, clearly that was a time for choosing, right?
Oh yeah. And she comments somewhere in one of her works that she thought, I'm thinking maybe it's her journals from the 40s, but I'm not sure, about how Armistice Day was on one of the feasts of Saint Michael the Archangel in May. And she had a particular devotion, by the way, to Saint Michael the Archangel, and has an image of him on her grave. Hell, in a way, had been unleashed on earth in her view.
Yeah.
And her husband also, as I read later in an obituary about her, he from the early 30s hated the Nazi regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that, having read Peter Zeewald's biography of Joseph Ratzinger, that comes out so strongly about him and his family too. Like there were these figures who, because of their faith, because of their Catholic faith, were um, you know, they didn't die martyrs again, but they did hold on to the faith in a way that it seems sadly like most of the rest of the people around them kind of didn't. You know, like they just kind of had to go along to get along. But there were people who kind of quietly didn't just go along to get along, and it seems like Görres is a little bit like that.
Yeah, and when we look at somebody who was close to her in her life, is a great Catholic novelist of the early to mid 20th century, Werner Bergengruen, who unfortunately is not well known, but he's one of these treasures we need to discover. And his wife was a descendant of the composer Mendelssohn, and thus, even though generations removed, she was considered by the Nazi laws Jewish. And he was excluded, therefore, from the Writers Guild, and his whole life was writing. He ultimately had to flee Germany, and he and Ida Görres were very good friends. These are their, circles, social circles that they're in. And he and his wife actually stayed with Görres. Even though I'm sure hosting those who are considered Jewish, is not popular at the time, they stayed with Ida Görres and her husband when they were leaving Munich to flee Germany to go to Switzerland. So that's sort of the milieu she's in.
Yeah. Well, a thought that I keep coming back to is that there were these really interesting things going on in Germany and France and a couple in other places in Europe in between the wars, where there was this attempt to kind of, okay, Christendom is gone, so what do we do now with Christianity? And there was this really interesting kind of human, sort of humane, intellectual, deeply faithful movement that was going on that was kind of obliterated by the Nazis, and then in some respects obscured by the prosperity of the post-World War II period. And there's part of me that thinks only now, almost 100 years after the end, or 100 years after the end of World War I, where maybe we can come back to that. I hope that maybe authors like Görres will help us.
Yeah, and also that I didn't really know much about the Catholic revival in the 1920s, early 30s at all until I started reading Görres and studying her life and her world. Is that was also obscured by problematic developments inside the church.
Yeah, right.
And you see this in Görres as she's trying to push. You see this in the 50s and 60s in her work, this tension struggle going on. And she knows what's going to be obscured from this revival she experienced that's inside Catholic realms. And she's also very concerned about how much things are changing outside in a way that's going to make life difficult for Catholics.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, maybe we're moving beyond that too. I don't know, but hopefully. Let's spend our last few minutes talking about conscience a little bit. This is one of the key things that Newman is known for, and I think sometimes misunderstood for. And Görres mentions here, it kind of made me chuckle actually, the notion of I wrote it down here so that I wouldn't lose it. But she says something here about, the term free thinker has gone out of fashion today. She wants to kind of draw our attention to this idea of like, what is a Christian conscience compared to just, somebody who nowadays we think of somebody who's obeying their conscience or whatever is somebody who's probably not obeying the teachings of the church, right? Like the two kind of aren't the same. And she wants to say, let's put them back together the way Newman did.
Yeah, and it's interesting, she writes about conscience in some of her other works as well. So I knew that this was an issue of concern for her. And in this book, she has this life of Newman in chapters 1-8, 2 poems she selects by Newman, which, by the way, to help readers, I think offer sort of a key to understand chapters 1-8. And then we get to part 2 of the book, which is a long, almost standalone monograph on conscience. And the fact that it is so long and in depth, I think, shows how important it was to Görres. And her concern is that conscience unmoored from God is like a compass that no longer has north on the compass.
Mm-hmm.
And she was also concerned about the development of trying to replace morality and virtue with a scientifically secularist ethics, and this loss of conscience and abuse of conscience, like you said, to mean like, well, whatever I feel today,
Right.
is of concern to her.
Yeah, I mean, we're unfortunately kind of reaping the, I don't know, the whatever the results of that now. I mean, how often you hear people say things like "my truth" or something. I mean, just what a preposterous thing to say. But it mostly goes without notice that people kind of think that way nowadays.
Well, and also I think we see this today in just the outright disinterest about whether or not we're going to have conscience protection in laws.
Right, right.
That the fact that would be something important is just missed on a lot of people, because the question of, well, what is conscience, has been so degraded and confused. And I'm hopeful that this book is going to contribute to sort of a refocus on that and just topic and an enrichment of it.
I hope so too, and I think it will. The name of the book is John Henry Newman, A Life Sacrificed by Ida Friederike Görres, translated by my guest today, Jennifer S. Bryson. This book is now available from Ignatius Press, wherever you get your books. I think everybody ought to get a copy. Newman fans, people who are interested in just something new, it's sure to offer something to everyone. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you.